Hello everyone, welcome to lesson 8 in French. It's past tense in French, or le passé composé. Today we're going to learn how to use passé composé in French by using avoir and être. And être verbs are Dr. and Mrs. Vandertramp, so we're going to be talking a little bit about that later on. And the goal by the end of this video is to be able to correctly use and identify passé composé when writing and speaking. Part 1 is le participe passé. I've just put some past participles here. So before we actually start with passé composé, we know the past participles for infinitive endings. So for example, for the infinitive ending er, like manger and stuff like that, we use a past participle of accent aigu. And we talked about the accents in lesson 1. And an example could be, again, like manger would change to manger with an accent aigu if we're talking about it in a past tense. For IR regular verbs, it's going to have a past participle of I. And for example, the verb fini would change into fini with an I. For RE, it's going to change into U. For example, vendre would be vendu. And I've also put some, or put one irregular infinitive ending. So for example, with NIR ending, so these are IR endings obviously, but usually the ones that have an N before it, like devenir, that would have a past participle of U. So for example, devenir, devenu, revenu, revenu, and venir would become venu. Partie de A, le passé composé de verbe régulier avec avoir. So this is a past participle, or sorry, this is past tense of regular verbs with avoir. There are two steps to form these regular verbs from present tense into past tense. First, you have to conjugate avoir itself. And that in this case, that would be our auxiliary. And step 2 is to use the list of participe passé, which is from right here, for the next verb. So basically, with passé composé, we always use two verbs. One would be the auxiliary. So for example, in j'ai, the auxiliary is a. That is a conjugated form of avoir for je. And then the next verb would be your past participle. For example, in this case would be manger. So taking a look at the example with an ER verb, such as manger, what we have to do is we just take out the ER. Like I said from part 1, we change that ER to an accent aigu. So for example, j'ai would be j'ai mangé, tu as mangé, il, elle, on, qui a mangé, nous avons mangé, vous avez mangé, et il, elle, ont mangé. Notice just how for regular, verbs with avoir, you don't need to make any agreement. So, for nous, vous, and il, elle here, they would be plural, but you're not going to be adding an S. Or, for example, for elle, you're not going to be adding an extra E after. That's only for être verbs, and we're going to be talking about that in just a bit. Let's try another example with IR, such as choisi. You're going to take out the IR and you're going to replace it with an I. So for example, j'ai choisi, tu as choisi, il, elle, on, qui a choisi, nous avons choisi, vous avez choisi, il, elle, on choisi. Again, it's composed of two verbs. The first one would be a conjugated avoir for each subject pronoun, and the other would be the past participle of your verb that you want to use in that sentence, in this case, choisi. And one more example with RE. So for example, attendre. J'ai attendu, remember it changes to a U because it's regular. So j'ai attendu, tu as attendu, il, elle, on, qui a attendu, nous avons attendu, vous avez attendu, ils, elles ont attendu. Partie de B, le passé composé des verbes irréguliers avec avoir. So there are two steps as well. You're going to conjugate avoir in relation to whichever subject pronoun you're using. And then step 2 is to look at a list of the past participles of the irregular verbs. You can find this online, and I have also provided some examples here. Again, these are not all the irregular verbs, of course, but these are the basic ones that you should memorize and ones that you will see most often. So here you can take a screenshot or just note these down. Again, there are many more. So here I have some examples of how we use it. Again, it's the exact same thing as regular. You still have your subject pronouns, you still have your auxiliary of avoir. You're just going to add those past participles of the irregular verbs. So for example, j'ai eu, blah, blah, blah. Tu as découvert, il, elle, en, qui a fait, nous avons vu, vous avez dit, il, elle, en été. And the reason I have these dots or the ellipses is because that, it's like I have had, you have to complete the sentence. It's not going to make sense if I just say j'ai eu. So part 3 is le passé composé avec être. And être verbs are found in Dr. and Mrs. Vandertramp. So I said in the beginning we're going to talk about it. I've also provided Dr. and Mrs. Vandertramp verbs over here. But first, before we get into that, there are 3 steps with être. So the first one is to conjugate être. The second one is to conjugate the past participle. And the third one is to add the ending. So remember how I said for avoir, you don't need to do any agreement. Well, for être and passé composé, you do. If it's masculine plural, you need to add an S. If it's feminine singular, you need to add an E. And if it's feminine plural, you need to add an ES. So here are the past participles of the Dr. and Mrs. Vandertramp verb. So the D stands for devenir, and that means to become. And the past participle is devenu, and if you need to add an E, you add an E. If you need to add S, you add an S. Revenir, revenu, monter, monter, rentrer, rentrer, sortir, sorti, venir, venu, arriver, arriver, naître, né, descendre, descendu, entrer, c'est entrer, retourner, retourner, tomber, tomber, rester, c'est rester, aller et aller, mourir et morte avec un T et parti avec un I. And the ones that are highlighted in gray, these are the kind of irregular ones. So even if you look at Dr. and Mrs. Vandertramp, they follow this chart here, where, for example, the ER would have an accent aigu, IR would be an I, RE would be U. It follows that. But some verbs like devenir, revenir, naître, venir, mourir, these are irregular, which don't follow those rules, so you have to sort of memorize them. So je suis monté, and if you're, for example, if you're saying the sentence and you identify as a female, then you would add an E. Tu es monté, il est monté without an E, elle est montée with an E for sure because it's elle, obviously. On est monté, qui est monté, nous sommes montés, you would add an E if needed. But the S would be there for sure because it's new, and new is plural. Vous êtes montés, ils sont montés, elles sont montées. If you would like to do some practice questions with avoir, you can do any of these. So like parler, regarder, adorer, chanter, and so on. And if you want to do some practice with être, you can do any of the verbs from Dr. and Mrs. Vandertramp. And if this is good for you, you can stop the video. But if you want to go one step ahead and just learn how to do passé composé with some things like negative and pronouns and so on, then we have part 4 here, les applications. So this is application kind of questions where we're applying the knowledge we just learned to things like negative, pronouns, and reflexive verbs. Starting with the negative, ne pas. The ne pas is just going to be like a regular passé composé sentence, but the ne pas is going to go around the auxiliary and the pronouns if there are pronouns. So for example, je n'ai pas mangé. The ne pas, in this case, it's an apostrophe because of the A for the auxiliary, but the ne pas goes around the auxiliary. And because there is no pronouns, and we talked about pronouns in our last 2 lessons, because there is no pronouns, it's totally fine. We ignore that part. So it's je n'ai pas mangé. Tu ne t'es pas fâché. Here, we have the ne pas going around the auxiliary, which is A. And in this case, there is also a reflexive tense. And here it's nous n'avons pas choisi. So in this case, we also have the ne pas surrounding the auxiliary. And here for the pronouns, you're going to place the COD ou COI avant l'auxiliaire. So you're going to place the direct object pronoun or the indirect object pronoun before the auxiliary, and an example could be like nous sommes réconciliés au restaurant. So if that's our sentence, the au restaurant changes to I, and we talked about this in the last lesson. So it'd become nous y sommes réconciliés. And the next one is with reflexive verbs. We haven't talked about these yet. It's going to be in lesson 12, so stay tuned for that. But reflexive verbs are verbs like se lever, se laver, s'aimer, s'amuser, and etc. So verbs that you're doing to someone or yourself. So for example, in this kind of reflexive verb, passé composé, the format is going to be like this. So you're going to have the subject, obviously, like je, tu, il, elle, qui, nous, vous, il, elle. Then you're going to have the reflexive pronoun réfléchi, such as me, te, ce, nous, vous, ce. And then you're going to have the auxiliary of être, so it's going to be like suis, et, some, et, sans. And then you're going to have the participe passé. And after that, if it's necessary, you're going to make an agreement. So we talked about agreements earlier. So if you need to add an E or an S or both, so that's going to be that. But if any of this is confusing you, you don't need to worry about it. Again, we're going to talk about reflexive verbs later on. But for now, negative and pronouns should be, it should make sense to you because we have talked about them before in previous lessons. So this is actually it for lesson 8. And with these practice questions, I am actually not going to be putting them in the description box because I don't know what you're going to be choosing to practice with. So just remember, it's just conjugating avoir and être, and then you're going to have the past participle of the verb you want to use. And if you want to go a step ahead, you can also complete the sentence. So for example, j'ai mangé la pizza, right? Instead of saying j'ai mangé. Just for practice. But thank you so much for watching this video, and see you in the next one.